No, no.
Generally, we're opposed to
Okay,
it.
we're gonna. Good morning, everyone. This hearing will come to order. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss the important legislation pending before the subcommittee. The four bills we'll discuss today address issues that are very important to veterans and their families. These bills would expand eligibility for burial in national cemeteries to certain spouses and children of service members, streamline the delivery of the DIC benefits to grieving family members, and extend benefits to veterans who are buried in National Park Service cemeteries. We will also discuss a bill that I introduced with Ranking Member Esty, H.R. 4958, the Veterans Compensation Cost of Living Adjustment Act of 2018. H.R. 4958 would give a cost of living increase for veterans and their families who receive VA disability compensation or other benefits. I'm proud to say that last year's COLA, which I also introduced with Ms. Esty, went into effect December 1st, 2017. And since COLAs are not automatic, are not automatically provided for veterans benefits to each year, it is essential that we pass this bill to ensure that veterans can keep up with the inflation, to maintain their standard of living, and receive the benefits they've earned. Of course, H.R. 4958 has my full support. I know many of my colleagues here today have worked hard on their proposals, and I look forward to having a productive discussion. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Esty for any opening remarks she might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very happy to be here this morning for the second legislative hearing of this Congress for the DAMA subcommittee. I've learned a great deal since I became ranking member of this subcommittee, and I feel like we've done a lot of good work together. Last year's COLA and appeals modernization bills were two prime examples. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your staff for the bipartisan way in which you have approached our responsibilities here, because it's more productive for veterans and, frankly, for Congress as a whole. So thank you very much. I won't review the four bills in detail before we begin, but I did want to highlight that I strongly support H.R. 4958, the Veterans Compensation Cost of Living Adjustment Act of 2018, sponsored by Chairman Bost and myself, and I'm very happy that I have joined again this year as the original co-sponsor. This bill ensures that important veterans' benefits keep economic pace, so veterans with service-connected disabilities and their surviving spouses who receive dependency and indemnity compensation do not see their benefits eroded when the cost of living increases. I also want to welcome, and I believe he's right outside the door, but will be joining us, our Veterans Committee colleague, Luis Correa, whose bill H.R. 4335, the Service Member Family Burial Act, is on the agenda today, and there he is, right on cue. This bill would make it easier for a veteran's child or spouse to be buried in a national veterans cemetery or state cemetery when they predecease a service member on active duty. These can be very tragic situations, and this will streamline a process being handled now by VA on a case-by-case basis. The bill is broadly supported by the Veterans Service Organizations and the VA, and I urge all of my colleagues to support it as well. And I also want to welcome to our other colleagues here today, General Walter Jones, who I believe will be joining us, and Representative Austin Scott to the Veterans Committee to testify on behalf of their bills. I look forward to their testimony and to the testimony of the VA and the VSOs. Thank you all for being here. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Esty. There we go. That's better. Thank you. We're honored this morning to be joined by two of our colleagues. The third may come along later. Any rate, Representative J. Luis Correa of California and Representative Austin Scott of Georgia. Welcome to both of you. We appreciate taking the time out of your day to be here with us and for sponsoring legislation that will help our nation's veterans. We'll be starting with on the full committee. We're going to let Mr. Correa is going to be here on the speaking from the dais. Mr. Correa, you're recognized for 5 minutes on H.R. 4335.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Bost and Ranking Member Esty, members of the committee for holding this most important hearing, and I do appreciate the opportunity to speak on this bipartisan measure, H.R. 4335, known as the Service Member Family Burial Act. I also want to thank my colleague and friend, Congressman Mike Kaufman, for his support in this legislation. Today, as you know, the National Cemetery Administration processes requests for burial of deceased spouses and dependent children of active duty personnel in national cemeteries on a case-by-case basis. The current process can be intrusive and difficult, especially when you take into context what's going on in a service member's life. This bill adds predeceased spouses and dependent children of active duty personnel to the list of people eligible for burial in national cemetery. It's a simple change, streamlines the process, and if you think about the situation of active duty servicemen and women when they have a family of their member predeceased them, I believe this is a very important issue, and I appreciate the opportunity to present, and I hope to count with your support, Mr. Chairman.
We now would like to go to Representative Scott. You will be speaking on, let me get this right because this thing's got cut, there we go, 4910. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Ranking Member and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for hosting me and allowing me to speak today on what I hope to be a very simple bill that will help people who are honored to be buried in our veteran cemeteries. H.R. 4910, the Veteran Cemetery Benefit Correction Act, if enacted, would require the Department of the Interior to provide outer burial receptacles, also known as grave liners, for veterans buried in cemeteries under the control of the National Park Services. Current law requires the United States Department of Veterans Affairs to provide an outer burial receptacle to a veteran buried in a national cemetery under the control of the National Cemetery Administration, a branch of the VA. Additionally, the VA can provide a reimbursement if the family chooses to purchase one in lieu of a government-furnished grave liner. However, cemeteries under the control of the National Park Services are not covered by this statute, and neither the VA nor the National Park Services are able to provide this benefit for veterans buried in those cemeteries. The Veteran Cemetery Benefit Correction Act would amend the law to require the Department of the Interior to provide an outer burial receptacle for each new veteran's grave in a national cemetery under the control of the National Park Service. This bill would also provide for the reimbursement of a veteran survivor who provides a privately purchased outer burial receptacle for use in a National Park Service cemetery. Of the 14 national cemeteries controlled by the National Park Services, there are two that are still active: Andersonville National Cemetery in Georgia in Congressman Sanford Bishop's district, and Andrew Johnson National Cemetery in Tennessee in Congressman Phil Rowe's district. I'm pleased that this is a bipartisan piece of legislation. It is simply common sense that we would treat the families in national parks the same as we treat those that are buried in the other veteran cemeteries, and I would appreciate your favorable consideration of this legislation.
Thank you, Representative Scott, and thank you for being here today. We will forego questions for our colleagues at this time. Any questions may be submitted for the record. Again, thank you for joining us here today and this morning. You're now excused if you want to leave, and if not, you want to stay, that's great too. I invite our second panel to the table. Joining us today from the VA is Ms. Cheryl Rawls, who is the Director of Pension and Fiduciary Services for Veterans Benefits Administration. Ms. Rawls is accompanied by Ms. Lisa Paz-Aban, right, who is Executive Director of the Office of Cemetery Operations for the NCA. We are also joined by Larry Lohman, the Assistant Director of National Legislative Division for the American Legion, and Mr. Carlos Fuentes, the Director of the National Legislative Services of Veterans of Foreign Wars. Thank you all for being here. Ms. Rawls, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present the Department's testimony.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to be here today to provide the views of the Department of Veterans Affairs on pending legislation affecting several of VA's programs. As you mentioned, sir, accompanying me is Ms. Lisa Pozzebon, Executive Director, Office of Cemetery, National Cemetery Administration. All right, so let's get to it. H.R. 888, Automatic Enrollment for Dependency and Indemnity Compensation, DIC, for survivors of certain totally disabled veterans. This bill applies to veterans currently eligible for DIC under Section 1318A of Title 38, which provides DIC to survivors, spouse or child, of a veteran who is receiving compensation or entitled to receive compensation for a service-connected disability, which was totally disabling. This bill would amend 1318 by requiring VA to treat a death notification the same as a claim for DIC. While VA is in tune to the intent of this bill, which is to provide expeditious, seamless claims process for these beneficiaries who have lost loved ones, VA does not support the bill for the following reasons. One, the bill could slow down our process as we currently have the authority and means to quickly pay those eligible under 1318 without the beneficiary filing a claim. Two, although VA may already have the requisite information to pay the DIC claim, the bill establishes a claim for everyone covered under 1318 and would require contact and development regarding the DIC claim. And lastly, this bill assumes eligibility and entitlement are the same, as the final decision for a claim that we have established on behalf of the beneficiary could possibly be denied by VA. H.R. 4335, Service Member Family Burial Act. This bill authorizes the Secretary to inter and provide a memorial headstone or marker for placement in a national cemetery for the spouse or child of active duty personnel with service other than dishonorable at the time of the spouse or child's death, providing there is documentation from a general court-martial convening authority. VA supports this bill as it ensures that active duty service members whose survivors die may bury their loved ones in a VA national cemetery. We truly appreciate the committee taking up our proposal, and we thank you. H.R. 4910. This bill would require the Secretary of the Interior to provide an auto burial receptacle for each new grave in an open cemetery under the control of the National Park Service. The bill calls for amending some of the authority provided the Secretary of Interior, and therefore the VA defers to the Department of Interior regarding this bill. Lastly, H.R. 4958, the Veterans Compensation Cost of Living Adjustment Act of 2018. The bill requires the Secretary to increase the rates of disability compensation in DIC by the same percentage as any increase for Social Security benefits effective on December 1st, 2018, as well as publish these increased rates in the Federal Registry. VA strongly supports this bill as it honors the sacrifice made by our service disabled veterans and survivors. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you again for having us here today to talk about these bills. We truly appreciate the committee taking up these proposals for our nation's veterans. This concludes my statement, and we are now happy to take any questions.
Ms. Rawls, thank you. Mr. Lohman, you are recognized for 5 minutes to give the testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Bost. Chairman Bost, Ranking Member Esty, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, on behalf of our National Commander, Denise H. Rohan, and the 2 million members of the American Legion, I thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding pending legislation before this critical committee. The bills before you this morning are common sense solutions, Mr. Chairman, and the American Legion is thankful for your leadership in bringing these forward. In consideration of time, I'll briefly touch upon the burial benefit bills, House Resolutions 4335 and 4910, and we'll primarily focus on House Resolutions 888 and 4958. As I have said, H.R. 4335, the Service Member Family Burial Act, and H.R. 4910, the Veteran Cemetery Benefit Correction Act, are bills that simply codify common sense benefits earned by those who have raised their right hand and taken the oath to defend the U.S. Constitution. H.R. 4335 would amend Title 38 to include family members of active duty members of the armed forces. This bill streamlines the application process for those on active duty and eliminates the need for waivers, allowing grieving families additional time to make proper arrangements during a difficult period. It just makes sense. In the same vein, H.R. 4910 is a common sense law that requires the Department of the Interior to provide outer burial receptacles for veterans' remains buried in open cemeteries under National Park Service control. A deserved benefit earned with a common sense law to provide for the benefit. For nearly 100 years, the American Legion has advocated on behalf of our nation's veterans to include the awarding of disability benefits associated with chronic medical conditions related to selfless service to this nation. H.R. 4958, the Veterans Compensation Cost of Living Adjustment Act of 2018, appropriately recognizes annual increases to cost of living and increases benefits commensurate with those cost increases for veterans with service-related medical conditions or veterans earning low incomes. For these veterans and their family members, this adjustment is a tangible benefit that meets the needs of the increasing cost of living in a nation they defended. The American Legion is pleased to support H.R. 4958 in part because it does not include two mechanisms we are resolved to oppose: consumer price indexing and round-down provisions. The American Legion particularly appreciates this bill does not include round-down provisions that have appeared in other legislation recently, including President Trump's proposed fiscal year 19 budget, where veteran benefits would be rounded down to the next whole dollar to save money. Rounding down is a slippery slope that dilutes the value of future benefits. Veterans should never have their benefits rounded down to provide legislative fiscal ease to help offset the cost of other government action. Veterans having served our nation have already paid the full price for this benefit, and as such should not have it diminished for accounting convenience. Next, the American Legion supports H.R. 888, a bill to improve dependency and indemnity compensation for survivors of certain totally disabled veterans. The American Legion has long supported any action that makes filing claims easier for veterans and their dependents. In 2015, the American Legion opposed VA standardization of forms, eliminating the ability for informal claims. Since that time, the American Legion has supported reinstating informal claims and adopted resolutions to reach that end, as well as generally ease administrative burden on veterans and their families. This bill eases the burden currently existing on surviving spouses and children of deceased veterans. Under current law, surviving spouses and children claimants must file a formal claim form to start the claims process for disability and indemnity compensation. This bill will improve and simplify the application process for surviving spouses and children of deceased veterans by requiring the VA to treat notification of the veteran's death as a claim for disability and indemnity compensation. Through Resolution Number 377, the American Legion supports legislation to enhance the quality of life for veterans, dependents, and their survivors. Because the reporting date of a veteran's death is data that can easily be ascertained by the VA for claim establishment and adjudication purposes, this bill is a common-sense, fail-safe solution to help grieving survivors. In closing, the American Legion believes in common-sense solutions that help our nation's veterans. Thank you again, Chairman Bost, Ranking Member Esty, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to present the American Legion's views and look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Loman. And Mr. Fuentes, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Bost, Ranking Member Esty, and members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the men and women of the VFW and our auxiliary, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to present our views on legislation pending before the committee. The VFW supports H.R. 888, which will require VA to treat a notification of death of a veteran rated totally disabled at the time of death as a claim by the veteran's surviving spouse or children for DIC benefits. The VFW believes this legislation would be a good step towards mitigating the need for grieving survivors to file additional paperwork to receive their DIC benefits. The VFW supports the Service Members Family Burial Act, which will require VA to provide headstones and markers for deceased spouses and dependent children of members of the armed forces serving on active duty. Currently, spouses and dependent children who precede their active duty service member in death are authorized in a case-by-case basis to be interred in national cemeteries. However, the process requires the approval of the Undersecretary of Memorial Affairs and often requires the active duty service member to submit information that may be intrusive and taxing, especially at a time of mourning, which also leads to unnecessary delays. Our brave men and women in uniform deserve a better process to honor their deceased loved ones. This bill would rightfully remove unnecessary barriers to ensure service members can spend an eternity with their loved ones. The VFW supports the Veteran Cemetery Benefits Correction Act, which would require the Secretary of Interior to provide outer burial receptacles to those who wish to be interred in cemeteries under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service. Currently, both VA and DoD are required to provide this benefit, but the National Park Service is not. There are 2 active cemeteries currently administered by the National Park Service that are open for new internments. Veterans who choose to be buried at these cemeteries deserve the same honor as those who are buried in VA and DoD cemeteries. The VFW supports the Veterans Compensation Cost of Living Adjustment Act 2018, which would adjust VA benefits for veterans and survivors to keep pace with inflation. Disabled veterans and surviving spouses and children depend on VA benefits to bridge the gap of lost earnings caused by a veteran's service-connected disability. Yet each year, they wait anxiously to find out if their benefits will keep pace with the rate of inflation because there is no automatic trigger that increases these forms of compensation for veterans and their dependents. It should not take an act of Congress to provide the same adjustment that is automatically granted to Social Security beneficiaries. The VFW is glad this bill would include automatic COLA increases based on the percentage increase under the Social Security Act. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
5 minutes, and I'll start the questioning. Mr. Rawls, please elaborate on your testimony as to why it is important for Congress to pass H.R. 4958, the Veterans Compensation Cost of Living Adjustment Act for 2018.
Thank you very much for the question. I will tell you that the veterans have sacrificed so much, and they're survivors, that it is important for us to allow them to continue to maintain their standards of living, to keep pace with everyone else, and to be treated the same as those who are receiving Social Security benefits.
Thank you. And okay, my second question is, Mr. Rawls, the VA usually knows when a service-connected veteran has surviving dependents. Can you please explain why the department believes it would harm families to set automatic convert compensation benefits to DIC for eligible surviving families and P&T veterans?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for that question. So currently the way the legislation is written is that it only deals with 1318A. That piece covers 3 types of veterans: POWs, those that are 100% service-connected and they have died they've been 100% service-connected for 10 years, or those who have recently departed the military and they have been out for less than 5 years and they have succumbed to their service connections. The other piece to that is that we need to have the spouse of record on hand, and that spouse of record needs to be that spouse of record for a year. We currently, right now, pay 53% of those claims automatically without having anyone file a claim based upon the information that we have in our systems. The only time that we are sending out this information is if we are not able to verify the spouse of record, if we don't have it on there for a year, or if it is in an estate where there's no one there, or if it is a child and we need to see who is going to be that person taking over that child. So that's why we have that 47% that we can't pay, but we send them information. If we were to establish that claim for those that we are able to pay, then we are asking them to do something that they really don't need to do because we have the information on record, sir.
Okay, thank you. That's important to know. Ms. Posbarn, can you explain the purpose of an outer burial receptacle?
Sure. The purpose of an outer burial receptacle is essentially to provide stability in the grave. And so while it provides a limited protection to the remains that are interred within it, it's not necessarily designed for preservation as much as it is stability of the grave so that the grave doesn't collapse.
Okay, so is this what we would know as a vault or not?
A vault is generally something different, and a vault can be a little more more of a significant structure that can provide a little bit more of that protection that I was talking about.
Okay.
And that's why sometimes families opt for a vault. They can be made of stronger materials and lined so that it will preserve the remains a little bit longer than an outer burial receptacle would.
I see. Well, there are currently only 2 open veteran cemeteries administered by the National Park Service. I note one of those is Chairman Rowe's district. Would it be a significant administrative burden for the VA to provide outer burial receptacles for veterans who choose to be interred into those cemeteries?
The issue is more that we do not have the statutory authority to provide those outer burial receptacles to the Park Service for use for veterans. So we do provide them in our cemeteries, as does Arlington, but we don't have that ability. We certainly would be willing to work with them and help them, implement a similar program as called for under this legislation.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I'm going to do it real quickly here. This is for the VO witnesses. Based on your experience, please share your perspective on why veterans should get a cost of living increase next year if Social Security beneficiaries get one. Mr. Loman, or either one.
Thank you, Chairman Bost. Generally, we support any benefit that would help a veteran, that helps with their cost of living, and this obviously raises it to keep up with inflation and helps to maintain a standard of living that they've become accustomed to.
Mr. Fernandez, I would assume that your answer is pretty well the same?
Yes, price of gas and general goods increase, so should the benefits.
Thank you, and my time's expired. Ranking Member Esty. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for joining us here today. I wanted to follow up, Ms. Rawls, with the conversation you were having with the chairman. We're striving for efficiency. I do have a concern. You indicated that this would slow things down to file claims, and you also, but what you didn't answer is a question I have, is what happens if you have a surviving dependent that doesn't file a claim? Would they receive anything? What if they're not in your system? What if the records are out of date or inaccurate and that person doesn't file? Wouldn't they then not receive any compensation under what you are proposing that we allow to continue?
So thank you very much, ma'am, for the question. And absolutely, there could be that circumstance. Right now, whenever we are notified of a veteran's death, the home of record that we have in our database, if we are not able to apply 1318A to that person, then we do send them out information as to how to file a claim and what their benefits consist of.
Well, I hope you will work with us on trying to get the efficiency that we have for spouses to be eligible for children as well. I think that is our shared goal, and you've raised some issues here today, but I think we've raised some back that merit further conversation and figuring out a way to make this as easy as possible. It is a 10-page form. We are hearing from constituents that this is a problem. They find it difficult. They find it offensive to have to go through this. I have to believe there's a better way than where we are now. I think I know the chairman shares that assessment. Our colleagues do too. So I hope you will work with us on that. And the VSOs are, I will know for the record, nodding their heads that this is something that we should do better, because part of it is about efficiency, but also recognizing the trauma and the loss that's reflected here. And it is human nature that people may have difficulty filling out those forms at that time, and they shouldn't be penalized for that. We should find a more efficient way of proceeding. Ms. Posbon, I wanted to again pick up with where the chairman left off. So is it your opinion and read of the law that Congress does need to act in order to empower VA to really effectively work with the Park Service to provide appropriate burial for veterans who choose to be buried in these important national sites?
So, yes, so currently, the statutory authority, the way it's written, requires that the Secretary provide the outer burial receptacle for veterans who choose to be buried in a national cemetery under the control of the National Cemetery Administration. So if we were to provide them, yes, that would, language would need to change in order for that to occur.
Thank you. I realize for anybody watching this, it may seem like a technicality, but it matters a lot to our veterans. And we know we have space limitations and challenges in some of our national veteran cemeteries. And for those who choose to be buried in these really beautiful sites that may be close to home, we want to facilitate that for veterans who make that choice and empower the VA to properly provide for the remains of veterans who choose that. So I think that looks like something we absolutely need to be passing through this committee. To Mr. Lohman and Mr. Fuentes, you got short shrift there in making the case to let people know why it is so important for our veterans to receive this cost of living increase, which is not automatic in the same way that it is for Social Security. So we're going to start with Mr. Fuentes, who was second last time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, ma'am. And I think what's very important that's included in here is the fact that it's automatic, because you have veterans who are really just waiting and hoping that Congress is able to act that year so that they are able to afford the increases in their electricity and gas and food and all of those basic necessities, right? Those increase, their benefits must increase as well, and it shouldn't take an act of Congress for it to do so.
Amen, yes. And we agree with you that it should be automatic, and we would prefer that it return to a point where it is automatic. That is as it ought to be. Mr. Lohman.
Yeah, I would just echo Mr. Fuentes' statement that we would really prefer it to be automatic as well and remove it from the equation and take veterans out of the debate.
Absolutely. I want to thank again the four of you for joining us here today. And I know the chairman and I absolutely, if we had that magic wand, we would wave it and make it automatic right now. Where we are at this point in Congress, this is what we can do. It's what we're doing, but don't mistake our commitment to try to get this rectified so it is permanent. It ought to be permanent. It ought to be automatic. Thank you very much.
Okay, if there are any other further questions for our second panel, you're excused, but thank you to everyone for joining us here today, for sharing your views with the subcommittee. Your testimony provides us with important insight into those proposals as we move forward and with this legislative process. I ask unanimous consent that all written statements provided for the record be included in the hearing record. I also ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on any of all the bills under consideration this afternoon. Without objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.